Hello and welcome to our 5th webisode of Peers in Pubs. Give me a sign, finding rhymes in ASL. Today's episode will consider deep questions about the utility of language and introduce you to intricacies in American Sign Language that blew me away. My name is Christina Wright, and I am your Peers in Pubs host. For those of you who are new to our program, Peers in Pubs is a way for any and all of you to learn about some of the work that is written in science communications. When you join us, we'll be asking a different specialist to explain a scientific publication, and we'll be bringing you along for the ride. Today, we'll be chatting about an open access paper, or one that's freely available to the public, about the ASL-LEX 2.0 project, a database of lexical and phonological properties for 2,723 signs in American Sign Language. But first, a few things before we get started. At Peers in Pubs, we're committed to constantly improving our programming and making sure our webisodes are enjoyable and accessible to anybody who wants to join in on the fun. Thus, we're thrilled to have 2 sign language interpreters with us today. One of them, Susan Boynes, who is on your screen right now. Thank you so much, Susan. And another, David Evans, who is on our screen at the bottom. Welcome to both of you. To all of our attendees, please maximize your screen to increase visibility of our interpreters, guests, and today's presentation on a whole. As always, if at any time you have suggestions for how we can improve, we'd love to hear them, so please reach out. If you would like subtitles for this event, we suggest you use the latest version of the Google Chrome browser. To enable live caption, click the 3 dots in the top right corner of the browser to get to the setting menu. Next, at the bottom of the page, click Advanced. In this menu, underneath Accessibility, turn on Live Caption, and you'll be all set. To get a copy of these instructions for yourself, you can Google Use Live Caption on Chrome, or you can click the link that we're providing in the chat right now. We have a chat box open on both YouTube and Facebook, so come and say hello. Let us know who you are, where you are, and if you're anything like us, what you're drinking. For me, it's a mimosa. Also, please leave any questions you want answered in the chat. We'll have someone scouting for your questions to ask later on in the event. I also want to let you know about something we're calling Jargon Alert. If at any point during the program you need a little bit more clarification, feel free to let us know in the chat. We want to make sure that you understand what's happening on this program. To keep things fun, we'll also have some trivia later on to test your sign language knowledge. If you want to play, we recommend you have a second device around, like a phone or a tablet, so you can keep watching the stream while you participate. Then there will be Peers in Pubs prizes for our top 3 players, so do your best and don't forget to have fun. All right, before we look at beautiful lexical and phonological data, let's get warmed up with a quick thought question. Drum roll, please. Can we think without language? Tell me what you think in the chat. Today, we're talking about an interactive visual database for American Sign Language that reveals how signs are organized in the mind. Before we get into that, I want to draw your attention to some interesting case studies that might inspire you to think a little deeper about the meaning and utility of language. The following anecdotes come from a Radiolab podcast that's available to the public from WNYC Studios called Words. This podcast is available both as a podcast and a complete written transcript at wnycstudios.org. You can click on the link in the chat or save it for later to visit this podcast at a later time. So can you imagine what it would be like to not have a language? Could you produce original thoughts if you didn't have words to do so? Would you have dynamic feelings that you could express, or would they be limited if you didn't have dynamic words to describe them? In the Words podcast, Susan Schaller talks about a man she calls Ildefonso in her book titled A Man Without Words. Ildefonso didn't know he was deaf from birth and was 27 when he met Susan, a sign language interpreter. He didn't know there was sound because he couldn't hear it. And miraculously, over 27 years, no one had taught him sign language. He could see mouths moving and people responding, but he thought all of interaction was accomplished visually and felt stupid because he just didn't get it. When Susan first realized that he simply hadn't learned how to sign, she started teaching him, but it was exceptionally difficult. If she gave him the sign for standing up, he thought she wanted him to stand up. Conversations were not possible. According to Susan, it was the most frustrating thing she had ever done as a sign language interpreter in her life. Then she had a brainstorm. She took Ildefonso out of the interaction and began signing to an invisible person in a chair in front of him. She demonstrated petting a cat and taught the sign for cat to the invisible student. Then she would hop to the other seat, the invisible student's seat, and pretend to understand it. After weeks of pretend student exercises, Ildefonso slapped his hands on the table as if to say, "Oh, everything has a name." After that, Ildefonso looked at Susan in a demanding way, and she signed table. Next, he pointed to the door, and she signed door. Then he pointed to a clock, and she signed clock. And last, he pointed to Susan, and she signed Susan. He started crying, feeling immense relief. It is clear that acquisition of language is incredibly powerful. But what happens when a piece of this process disappears? Later on in the Words podcast, they describe an American neuroanatomist's experience during a stroke. Jill Bolte Taylor describes that during her stroke, her inner voices went silent, which allowed her to find peace inside of herself that she had not known before. Perhaps more intriguing, without her inner chatter, she lost all definition of her body and self in relation to everything in the external world. This type of inner language is ongoing information processing. She says, it's a constant reminder. I am. This is my name. This is all of the data related to me. These are my likes and my dislikes. These are my beliefs. There's a separate TED Talk about her story called My Stroke of Insight, if you want to learn more about her experience in particular. But I wanted to end this portion of today's program by asking you to consider the following. What do words do for us? Are they necessary? Can you think and feel without them? Can you dream without them? What if all a person really is just the story we tell ourselves? All right, enough with the extras and on to the main event. Let's learn more about harnessing the power of words using American Sign Language. Please let me introduce our scientist and presenter for the day, Dr. Zed Sehyr, a language scientist at San Diego State University. When she's not doing science, you will find her hiking, running outdoors, or playing soccer. She lives with her housemate, Matt, and although they don't have any pets or plants, they do make cool and silly art and drink beer together. Welcome, Zed. So lovely to have you back.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this wonderful show. I've been enjoying this for quite some time.
Oh my gosh, of course. And we'd be remiss if not to mention that you are joined today by your very close friend and partner in crime and our guest, Rachelle Archer, a mom, an artist, and a dance party instigator. Rachelle works as an educational consultant and expressive arts practitioner. She supports the health and wellness of educational leaders so that they can continue to impact young lives. Everyone, please welcome Zed and Rachelle and David and Susan. Phenomenal. All right. So, Rachelle, let's start with you. I want to know if you're familiar with Zed's research. In your words, what do you think she does?
So I know a little bit about what she does. And I think with this particular project, what she's been doing is mapping out different signs and the location that correlates with the brain so that they can understand language development and its connection to signs, and they're cataloging signs visually somehow. And I'm not sure exactly what all the applications are, but I know there's a catalog with many, many signs that they're doing wonderful things with.
I love it. Zed, how does that sound to you?
That sounds pretty spot on, actually, I have to say.
Well done, Rachelle. Well done.
I didn't cheat, I promised.
I mean, we may have to work a little bit on getting you some more information, and I'm happy to do that.
That's why we're here.
Perfect. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to have you here today. We want to get a better feel for your friendship. I think, Zed, you might have something that you want to share for us so that the viewers can get a better feel for how you guys know each other and what we've got on our screen today.
Okay, well, Rachelle doesn't know this, but let me see. Let me see if my sharing works here. All right, this is the big test. Woo!
Oh my gosh, this is adorable.
So,
Goofing.
There are many stories to tell, fortunately, but unfortunately, we don't have time for those today. But I just wanted to visually represent the beautiful 6 years of our friendship. And I just collected some of the highlights from over the years. Rachelle and I met in 2015, and it's been quite a ride since then. We've been to music festivals, we've been bike riding together, we have been to dress-up parties, we made some wonderful crafts, including tiny hats. And yeah, so we've just been having a really great time together, and her friendship means a lot to me. And it means a lot to me that she is here today to listen to me talking about my work.
Phenomenal. I mean, you guys just, obviously, those are some incredible experiences. You're obviously so lucky to have each other in your lives. Providing, Rachelle, do you agree with this? Are you okay with her saying that you're this close?
I agree 100%.
Okay, all right. I just didn't want to assume anything. No, thank you so much for giving us a glimpse into what your friendship is like. I think it brings a really special quality to our program today. And I mean, you're so lucky. These are the types of people that inspire you. Friendships like this are once in a lifetime and super critical to mental health, physical health, and watching each other soar. So it's awesome that you have her and you have someone who's interested in learning about what you do, not only just having the fun stuff. So let's move on. I think I'm going to hand it over to Zed completely in order to have our presentation start. So Zed, let's learn about ASL-LEX 2.0.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to talk to you about this project that I've been working on for quite some time. So really, in a nutshell, just to kind of elaborate a little bit on Rachelle's amazing guess about what I do. So the things that I do, basically my research involves many projects, but the main question, the kind of things that I'm mostly interested, the kind of thing that gets me out of the bed is sort of looking at language and the brain, and how the brain really deals and supports language. And specifically, I look at how I study sign languages, as well as many other languages, but sign languages mostly as a kind of as a way to figure out what is universal to all human languages. So that is very much in a nutshell what I do during the day and night sometimes. All right. So I hope you can all see my slides. Today, I'll be talking to you about this very unique and amazing project that I've been so fortunate to be involved in. And it's basically a project that's been going on for quite several years, actually. It's a collaboration. It's a collaboration among many deaf and hearing scientists across the US. Many people are involved in this project, so this is by no means a work of my own. But it's actually a really amazing project, as hopefully at the end of it you will all be familiar with. Okay, so so the words joke and ruin don't rhyme in English, but they do happen to rhyme in American Sign Language, as you can see on the screen. Just like in English, poets can choose words that sound alike, that rhyme. Sign language poets can choose signs that visually echo one another. So you could say they're kind of visual rhymes. But how do we find signs that rhyme with one another? How do we find rhyming signs in ASL? So in English, and I'm giving English as an example here because that's the language we're probably most familiar with. So in English, you can simply search through your mind, or you can look up a dictionary, or you could go to a database online where you can look up various words. So you could see, like this one, for example, WordNet, where you can find many English words and information about these words. But until recently, there hasn't been such database available for sign languages. So our team of deaf and hearing scientists across the US collaborated with a group of software engineers at Boston University to create ASL-LEX database. And in this database, we cataloged information about almost 3,000 ASL signs. And we built a visual, searchable, and interactive website that is free for anyone to use. Now, this database is truly first of its kind at this scale. And it allows linguists and scientists to work with ASL in entirely different ways.
That's crazy. I just can't believe I never thought that rhyming in ASL would be different than rhyming in English. Obviously, that's because I'm biased and I have less experience, but that's just blowing my mind. And how, like, what an oversight on my end. This is unreal.
What I'm loving about this is I'm a dancer, and to me, that almost is more analogous with how we communicate in dance. So I'm loving sort of the creative connection there.
That is true. Actually, oftentimes motion is very salient, very important, and can be very much part of ASL rhymes. Excellent.
So cool.
I will tell you more about this database, but I just wanted to tell you that we published an article about this research earlier this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And You can also read reduced, more grandma-friendly, perhaps, a version of this article in the conversation online.
We love accessible chats and accessible versions of documents. I know some publications, even as a neuroscientist, I can't get through them.
Very true, very true. All right, so what are you guys in for today? So I'm just going to give you a brief overview what's coming up. Okay, so I'll give you a little bit of a background for the motivations for the study and a little bit of a background to the main concepts, and hopefully I bust some jargon here. Then I will tell you how we did this. What did we do? How did we do this research? And then I'll tell you a little bit about what we found. So we obviously have a lot of information. So we were naturally curious about, well, are there any interesting patterns in the lexicon in ASL? And I will end on talking a little bit about why this is important. You know, why do we care about this? Why do we want to know about the, ASL vocabulary? Why is this important? And who mostly benefits from this work? So when we communicate in any language, we must search through our vocabulary to find the right words or signs. We all have a mental vocabulary, right? So we have vocabulary of words that we use and recognize. And this vocabulary is sometimes called the mental lexicon. Now, how quickly and efficiently we search for the right word or sign really depends on how our mental lexicon is organized. Mm-hmm. So our team, and basically the main goal of this was to first figure out what information people use to organize their signs, and then construct or build a visual representation, so visually illustrate this information and how signs are related in the lexicon to each other. So we build this network map, which I'll show you in a minute.
Could I ask you a quick question? Are different types of items stored differently in the brain? So maybe more I don't know, adjectives versus nouns or things like that. Are they different in the way that they're organized, or?
That is an excellent question. Thank you. Yes, there are many different ways that items are organized in our vocabulary or mental lexicon. And I will talk about 3 different ways that we can organize our vocabulary. But you mentioned nouns and verbs, and that is indeed also another way that we can sort or catalog or group our words into different groups based on where in a sentence they appear. So that is definitely an information we use to look up signs in the mental lexicon.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks.
Excellent question. Thank you. Okay. So, for example, if you were to go into the website, into the visualization, and look up the sign for joke, you would learn that joke visually resembles or looks like many other signs. So, for example, ruin or tease. And so you could consider these signs visual rhymes. And researchers believe that signs that are visually related in this way may come to mind more readily when a person thinks of a sign for joke. And what you're looking at here is just a snapshot of the visualization where each node represents individual sign. So how did we build this database? So obviously we needed to have a lot of information, but we really wanted to focus on some of the main ways that we know people organize vocabulary. And some of this information comes from research with spoken languages. So for example, how visually similar signs are to one another, or how frequent signs are. So how frequently signs are used in everyday signing. And we also looked at this really interesting property of signs called iconicity, which I'll explain later. And that refers to how much the sign actually looks like what it means. So I will try and break these down now for you. So first, I'll start with visual similarity, which I've already alluded to by giving the example of ASL rhymes. So to figure out how similar signs are to one another, we have to look at the form, how they are composed. So our team went and meticulously analyzed each of the almost 3,000 signs in ASL for many, many different visual properties. For example, the location, where is the sign produced? So in this example, it's produced on the head. Or hand shape. What kind of hand shape is involved in the sign? How many fingers are being used, and are they bent, or are they crossed, and so on. And then also we looked at movement. What kind of movement is involved, and what kind of movements do the hands perform? And so we use this information about signs to organize the map by these components. And really, this is how researchers believe that designers can organize their signs together, organize the signs in the mental lexicon. Now, in the visualization, you may notice, if you click on the node, that some signs are related to many, many other signs. It's kind of a very dense network, which we sometimes call neighborhood. And so, or cluster, or neighborhood cluster. So within these clusters, signs look alike visually, like the signs joke and Rowan. But some signs visually have very few neighbors. They exist in much, much sparser clusters or sparser neighborhoods. So they have just fewer friends.
And they're good friends, though. Maybe they're good friends like Rachelle.
They could be besties. Exactly. So some of you might actually be familiar with this phenomenon called tip of the tongue moments. I'm pretty sure everyone has experienced one at some point in their lives.
I think I had it just a moment ago and I couldn't think of the word that I was trying to use.
It's when speakers cannot momentarily remember the word, but they may have the first sound of the word, but they just can't remember the rest of the word. They know it. So this is called tip of a tongue moment. And these moments have served as evidence that speakers organize their words by sounds, so by their form. Now, the question is, can deaf signers also experience an equivalent of the tip of a tongue? And it turns out that they can. Yeah. So if Nicolas Cage was a signer, he might experience something what we refer to as the tip of the fingers moment, where perhaps he could remember the hand shape that the sign is made of, but not the rest of the sign, like where it's produced or what kind of motion is involved. And this is taken as evidence that signers also organize their signs by form, just like speakers organize their words by sounds. Isn't that cool?
What?
That makes absolute sense. It makes absolute
Makes absolute sense. Excellent.
Unreal.
All right. The next property that we looked at that people might organize their signs by is how often these signs are used. So we believe that frequent signs that are used every day, a lot, can be thought of or called up much more readily than signs that are used much less frequently. So we wanted to find out how frequent ASL signs are in day-to-day signing. Now, here's the thing. For English, we can go to the internet and we can look up large amounts of text and literally count the number of times a word appears in the text. and that tells us how frequent these words are in English, right? But for ASL, and in fact, other sign languages, there isn't a written form. So there isn't a writing system for sign languages. So how do we find out how frequent signs are? So we thought we could just ask deaf signers about their intuitions. I mean, surely they should have pretty good intuitions about how frequently they use ASL signs, right? And so our team asked almost 130 deaf ASL signers to look at signs and rate on a scale. We gave them a scale from 1 to 7, where 1 means not frequent at all. I don't use this sign at all. Or, 7 means I use this sign every day, frequently. And so we asked them to rate each sign on this scale. And of course, the larger number on the scale represents higher frequency for each sign. And in the visualization, we represented this information, this frequency information, by the size of the nodes. So you can see that larger nodes correspond to more frequent signs, and smaller nodes correspond to less frequent signs. So you can go into the visualization and spot all the really frequent signs that there are in ASL-LEX, and maybe you want to learn those first, because they will be.
That makes a lot of sense. So a guide to learning sign language. Go for the big heavy hitters first, and you'll be able to respond in more conversations right off the bat. That makes a lot of sense. I always got very frustrated when I was taking French class and I had to learn all of these things that I was never going to use. And they didn't teach me how to actually, they didn't teach me the ones that you would need if you went to France and had to order breakfast.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
Okay, and so the third thing that we focused on was iconicity. So iconicity refers to the idea that a sign kind of looks like what it means, right? And this property is really unique. Well, it's very abundant in sign languages. Unlike spoken languages in English, it really isn't very common. So in sign languages, in ASL specifically, again, we wanted to identify signs that are really, really iconic, that look like what they mean, and signs that don't. So here's an example for you. The sign for drink is highly iconic because it, in fact, looks like the act of drinking. But the sign for brother is not iconic because it doesn't look like an actual brother. But we're scientists. How do we measure how iconic signs are? So again, we went and asked a large group of deaf ASL signers to decide for us how iconic the signs in our database are. So we gave them a scale from 1 to 7, and we said, how much the sign looks like what it means. From 1 as not iconic at all, 7 being very, very iconic. And the higher the value, the more iconic the sign is. And you can find all this information in this database if you wanted to. But I thought we could have a little game now with everyone in the audience.
Oh boy.
All
right.
You guys should maybe take pen and a paper, or you could just do this in your mind. That's fine. It's a very short game. I'm going to show you 3 signs in ASL, and your task is to guess what these signs mean. How does that sound?
Okay.
Let's do it.
I think we can handle it.
All right. Let's see how you do on this one. All right. So I'm going to show you the first sign first, and then the second and the third. All right. Okay. Ready, steady, go. What does the first sign mean? Okay, take your best guess, and I'm going to show you the second sign now. And sign number 3. And of course, this.
I'm laughing at some of the comments. Somebody put perm on one of them.
That's good. That's good.
Amazing. I cannot wait to see all the comments, all the guesses.
I'm fairly certain I got 100%. So I just want to share my answers with you right now.
Well, of course, if you know ASL, this should be easy, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was very clear that the first one was opening a pickle jar. And the second one was telling someone that something has horns. And then the third one was how you would indicate something is about this big. It's about this big. Yeah. So, you know, I know what I'm talking about clearly.
Interesting. Very interesting. Rachelle, what was your guess?
My guess on the first one was to like make something with your hands. It had this like making feel to me. The second one was to me thinking, like I'm thinking about something. And the third one, I agree that I thought that was like something that was little, like demonstrating that something was small.
All right.
I like the ones in the chat a lot more than what I
I can't see the chat, so I'm blind.
There's like very funny ones. Crazy, puppy, pet, DJ, spider. Like we've got all kinds of good ones.
We should start a band name with all of these.
This is amazing. Okay, are you ready to see the answers?
Yes.
Yes, please.
All right.
What?
Okay. So clearly, as much as this exercise was, it illustrates a really important point. And the point is that you truly have to know ASL. You truly have to know the language to be able to understand what the sign means. So signs are not readily transparent to those who don't know the language.
Absolutely. I also want to thank you for teaching us the sign for bake, because I'm a big fan of making pies and I'm really going to need that one. It's going to be a frequently used term for me.
Yeah, and I might ask you for a lot of these in the future, Zed. Like cookies, bring cookies on. Zed is an amazing baker, by the way.
We'll have to have a challenge. I actually have a quick question. So like for that one, oh goodness. Don't look at the camera, look at your hands. Is there a difference between, like, are terms the same if you use if you do it on the left versus on the right? Or is that like a different, is there a directionality to American Sign Language?
For most signs, it really depends on the signer's dominant hand. So
okay.
if for many signers, the dominant hand is, just like speakers, the dominant hand is right hand. If the dominant hand is left hand, then the sign is reversed.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
So cool. So cool.
Excellent. Well, good job, guys. You did pretty amazing. All right. So I just wanted to now spend a little bit of time talking about the findings. So clearly we've collected all this really amazing information about ASL signs. And as soon as we did that, some really amazing patterns started to emerge from the data. So I'm just going to give you a little flavor of what we found. So when we looked at the data, what we saw is that frequently, or very common signs tended to be shorter and simpler than less common signs. And this is a pattern that is actually true for both signed and spoken languages. So mother here is an example of a very common and simpler sign, while the sign for hippo is an example of rare and quite complex sign. And we think that this is because signs that are used in everyday conversation become simpler over time to really allow for more efficient communication, just like spoken words do. Now, we also found that common signs have more visual neighbors or visual rhymes, as we explained earlier, than less common signs. So if you click on some nodes in the ASL-LEX database, you will see that they're related visually to many, many other signs. And if they have more neighbors or more friends, they tend to be also more frequent. So think about it, it's like the people who go frequently to all the parties. Like, have many, many friends. But some signs have no related visual rhymes and no related neighbors in the lexicon, like the sign vampire. So they tend to be more isolated. All right. I think I'm doing okay for time, right? Do I have some time left, or do I have to finish?
Yeah. No, we've got about four more minutes left to your presentation, so keep going.
Excellent. All right. So now that you know what we did and how we did this and what we found, well, how do we use this database? How do we use this resource? And that's a really important thing to ask is, why do people care? Why should the funders give us money to continue this research? The ASL-LEX database has actually been put to quite a lot of uses already. So one of the purposes of this research, of this project as a whole, was really to have impact on, contribute to learning and education. So how can we as teachers and parents really kind of support education? And the tool can help teachers and parents of deaf children to perhaps teach ASL more constructively. I mean, it cannot be solely used as a tool by any means, because it's just a collection of words. There's clearly a lot more to signing than just vocabulary, right? But it can be used as a tool to assist learning process. So for example, here's a situation. Many deaf children, so let me back up. So children learn language from the people that surround them, right? So their parents, their caretakers, and so on. And so regardless whether they are learning spoken or sign language, they have to learn vocabulary. But deaf children aren't typically surrounded by people who know ASL, like their hearing parents. We know that the majority of deaf children are born to hearing parents who may just be starting to learn ASL or any other sign language at the same time as their children do. So one of the goals is that teachers or parents can use this tool to, for example, identify signs that are most frequently used, and then use these signs to teach those signs first, because those would be the most helpful to the students.
Super useful.
How can ASL-LEX assist further science? In fact, many scientists and researchers have already used the information in a database to conduct scientific experiments and test some really important theoretical questions about language, just like the one you asked at the beginning, Christina. That was an excellent question.
Yes.
So, for example, as I mentioned already, iconicity is a very common property of sign languages, and it's unlike spoken languages. So this is something very specific to sign language. And one of the really interesting questions is whether these iconic signs, the signs that resemble their meaning, can be actually learned quicker or faster or earlier than signs that do not look like what they mean. So that's a really interesting question that's being tested using information from ASL-LEX. And thirdly, databases for spoken languages have been instrumental in developing speech recognition technologies like Alexa and Siri, but deaf people tended to be excluded from these technologies. We, as the ASL-LEX team, provide through this database machine-readable data that would open door for similar AI developments in sign recognition or automatic translation software. And here is one thing I really need to stress out. although we do a lot of basic science research, the information or the knowledge that we put out there really needs to be used responsibly, and it needs to be used with the interests and the needs of the deaf community at heart. The deaf community, who is really one of our major stakeholders in this research. So we really need to liaise and communicate with the deaf community to see really what is it that they want the technology, which way do they want the technology to go for them? What kind of needs do they have that we can assist with? And really, I just wanted to say that, as I said at the beginning, this project involves thousands of people, participants, researchers, programmers, linguists, users, artists, educators, reviewers, admins, and the funders. So many people have been involved in this work, and I really hope that they continue to be involved in this work, because this is what makes this research really, really unique and useful. And I will just say massive thank you to all my collaborators, Dr. Karen Emery and Cindy Farnady, who are based at San Diego State University, Dr. Naomi Caselli, who's based at Boston University, and Dr. Ariel Cohen-Goldberg, who's based at Tufts University. And of course, the beautiful website visualization would not be possible without the amazing dedicated work by the Software and Application Innovation Lab at Boston University, and of course general funding from the National Science Foundation. And I will say thank you very much to all of you who spent their Friday afternoon with me, listening to me talking about this work, and thank you ever so much. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for that presentation. I mean, clearly just from the end, like, the best science is collaborative science, and in order to achieve something as important and monumental as this, it takes a lot of people. So it's always important to make sure that we give a shout out to the bigger team. I'm really interested in so much, and I can't wait to hear the questions from our audience, but I did want to ask one more question for you just real quick before we move on. I'm wondering if the origins of maybe older signs more iconic? Like, were those maybe the ones that were easier to come up with, and then things kind of expanded beyond that? Do you know if there are any trends in kind of like over the course of the development of American Sign Language, if like the nature of the signs has changed, kind of like slang in spoken word, I guess?
Yes, this is an amazing question, and there's a lot of really great research with some emerging sign languages, like the Nicaraguan Sign Language, where the researchers really have had the opportunity to record or observe language from its very origins to the fourth and the fifth generation of that language. So language is a living thing, right? So generations pass the language onto each other, and it's been really incredible that we have this possibility to do that for a sign language, because we can't really do that for spoken languages. They're far too old. Right. We don't really know what happened at the origins of spoken languages, but we can see some of the processes in some of the newer, younger sign languages that develop, that emerge in signing in communities where really a lot of deaf and hearing people interact together, right? Like in Nicaragua. So definitely signs do begin quite iconic. We actually do have some evidence for this in ASL-LEX database. We found that signs that are used more commonly tend to be less iconic. So signs that are used frequently in everyday conversation kind of move away from their iconic origins a little bit. And so this is a really interesting observation that we were only able to make with a larger data set, really, truly to see signs that we use frequently do tend to move away from their iconic origins. It doesn't mean completely, because they are still somewhat iconic, and a lot of them are iconic a lot, but there is a tendency that with frequency of use, signs do deplete in how much they resemble their meaning.
Wow, that's awesome. All right, so thank you so much for your presentation. We're going to move on to our trivia section now and collect our questions from our audience members in the chat. Rachelle, also, if you have questions, keep them in your head because you'll be able to interact with us yet again at the end. So now, friends, we're going to go and give you the chance to step up and demonstrate your ASL knowledge. But before that, I want to remind you that Taste of Science is a nonprofit, and we rely on science lovers just like you to keep our programs running. If you could go to tasteofscience.org and hit donate, we'd be much obliged. With that, let's get to trivia so you can earn some prizes. We're going to sit back on our end for 5 minutes, play some music, and see how you do. Head to the chat box for trivia information. You can go to the nearpod.com trivia link there, or go to www.nearpod.com and type in the code you see in the chat. When you enter your name, feel free to put a fun spin on it, but for prize purposes, make sure we can identify who you are based on your registration information. Please note you'll want to watch your device and not the live stream during trivia because there can be a lag between the two. Anyway, good luck. We'll be back in 5 minutes. All right, everybody. I hope you had fun with our little trivia quiz. I can see on our winner board, we have Rhyme and Shine, Natalie, and Hippo as our top 3 players. So congratulations. Please reach out to us via DM on Facebook or on any of our social media channels to claim your prize. Great job, Rhyme and Shine, for running top place. All right. So with that, let's move on to the Q&A section of our program. Zed, our audience has been super busy sending us questions for you. Are you ready to go? Awesome. Okay, so our first question is, how does poetry look like? What does poetry look like in ASL? Does it have patterns like a haiku would in spoken language where there are no more than 17 syllables?
That's a really great question. And I almost want to share a link to this amazing, there's actually a lot of really amazing examples of ASL poetry on YouTube, on the internet. And it looks, I'm not really an ASL poetry expert. I'm still kind of learning ASL, although I'm probably a perpetual learner. ASL poetry is very visual. It really is unlike spoken language poetry, even though it's based on the same principles. It really is rhyming visually, and there are a bunch of really, really great resources for, that really show how ASL poetry can be constructed, how it works. But really, in a kind of nutshell, you could have, for example, signs that end on the same handshake, or you could have signs that where the hands perform the same movement. And there is really a lot more to it. There is it's not just the hands that are in action, it's the whole body. It's the use of space. It's the facial information. So it is a very, it is a very involved process, and it's very beautiful. And I absolutely love watching skilled ASL poets to perform poetry. And so I encourage everyone to go on. I can share some links later with you guys. Just go online and look at examples of ASL poetry, because I'm struggling to describe it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely.
One of my favorite experiences was going to a wedding with another friend of ours who was in a similar research field, who had a deaf poet at her wedding who performed some poetry at the wedding, and it was absolutely beautiful. So yes, I can attest to how cool it is to see that.
Oh my gosh, that's so awesome. Yeah, feel free, if there are any websites that you can lead our viewers to, feel free to put them in the comment section for everybody.
I just wanted to also mention one of the examples that immediately pops to my head is, if you go to our conversation article, we start with an example with a poem that is so beautifully articulated and interpreted by Lauren Ridloff, who is an American actress and an award-winning actress, I should say. And so we show a poem that she recorded for the Times magazine as an amazing example of how sign language poetry works. So go to the conversation piece if you want, or just look up on YouTube. You can look up Lauren Ridloff poem, and you will see an amazing example of poetry right there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Rachelle for a second and just check in with you. Did you have any questions that came up over the course of the presentation that you wanted to ask Zed?
Well, as we were talking more about, when you brought up the idea of the history of different signs, it just made me think of how much I don't know about the history of sign language. And when were like the first documented cases, like where did these things first emerge, or what are the earliest records of people using sign language? That would be super interesting to me.
So every sign language, of course, there are many, many different sign languages across the world. And some of them are related, but most sign languages are not related to one another. Sign languages really emerge in the pockets of communities where deaf and hearing people communicate with each other. And so they are not necessarily related to one another. And so just like in the United States, there is the deaf community in the United States uses American Sign Language, which, by the way, has many different dialects also. And there is the Black ASL, there is an ASL dialect in Philadelphia. So there are very different dialects across the US, but there is American Sign Language in the United States. You have British Sign Language in the United Kingdom, or you could have Czech Sign Language in the Czech Republic. And these sign languages are all very different, and they're unrelated, they're mostly unrelated. And so they're relatively young languages. Some of the earliest mentions, we do know a little bit about the history of ASL. ASL is closely related to the French Sign Language, and this is because they do have a shared history where, several centuries ago, a scholar in France came to the US to educate deaf children in the United States and brought over the sign language that he knew, that was French Sign Language, and influenced the signing of the deaf children here in the United States. And that's how kind of sometimes, we do know, but the history really is it's not very, very deep. It, a couple of hundred centuries. I mean, I'm sure there are some earlier records. I can't remember the dates off the top of my head, where a wedding ceremony was conducted in sign language in like the 12th century, but mostly these records are not very, they're pictorial, or we don't really have a good record of sign languages as well, until much more recent history.
That's so cool. I'm embarrassed to say that I never even thought of there being sign languages outside of ASL, because that's the only one that I've ever come across in my life. And that's so embarrassing. How did I not know any of this existed? My goodness. We've got another question from our audience, and they want to know, as the title implies, ASL exhibits rhyming, which we talked about today, but does ASL include other things like onomatopoeia?
Great question. So onomatopoeia is kind of like iconicity, right? So when the form of the sign looks like its meaning, it's probably the closest example to onomatopoeia, where in English we can make sounds with a mouth that resemble the sounds in our environment. We can produce signs that look like the meaning. We cannot 100% accurately reproduce the meaning of the sign, but I would say that is the closest example to onomatopoeia when we talk about sign iconicity, is the extent to which the sign form actually looks like what it means. But of course, it's very important to remember that even if the sign looks like what it means, it still conforms to the grammatical rules, the phonological rules of the language. So it's not just like gesturing, where I am enacting something that, that is a very different thing. In sign language, the language in ASL, it still follows the rule of the language.
So cool. Okay, we've got another question from our audience. I think this one's super interesting. So in spoken language, if you speak French, it's easier to learn Spanish. in sign language, if you speak one language, is it also easier to learn another, or are they so different that that they're not as tied in that way?
Oh my gosh. I wish that were the case, that it was easier to learn another sign language if you already know one. I can tell you from my personal experience that I first learned British Sign Language. This is where I started doing my research in the UK, in London. And so I picked up British Sign Language, and then I moved to the United States and I started working with American Sign Language. And I can tell you, it's not really that much easier.
Bummer.
Science is so different. And in fact, there are many false friends. So, you have a sign in British Sign Language that means something completely different in American Sign Language. So that's just really confusing.
Yeah, I can see myself getting mixed up for sure. My goodness. Okay, we've got another one. This person from our audience wants to know, is there a stigma against non-hearing people to learn sign language? Is there like a resistance to learning the language, a resistance against appropriation in some way?
This is a very, very good, but also very complicated question.
Yeah.
It is very difficult. Yes, sign language. We should not assume that everybody who is deaf knows sign language, right? Just like we shouldn't assume that everybody who works in science has to learn English, or all these assumptions. It's very difficult. The problem for a lot of deaf children is, and I really, really just briefly touched on this. A lot of deaf children are born to hearing parents, and the hearing parents often are not familiar with ASL. They're not familiar with deaf cultures. They talk to a lot of doctors, and oftentimes there is a push for making sure that the children can hear and encouraging them to use speech as opposed to sign language. And there is a lot of confusing information a lot of the times, and there's also preferences. And there's a lot of everyone's choice to identify and to learn the language that they want. But for a lot of small children, they don't really quite have the choice. It's the parents who make the choice on their behalf. And so it's a very, very difficult topic. I think what is really important to remember is that the longer sometimes we wait when a deaf child is born, the longer we wait, the longer we're kind of like allowing them to, it's really, really important that children are exposed to language early on. And this could be spoken language, this could be sign language. And sometimes, it's very sad that there is a lot of stigma for people to know sign language, and also the type of communication. The diversity in which people communicate is enormous. Some people use a mixture of sign and spoken language at home because that's how they communicate with their hearing family members. Oftentimes there isn't an ideal ASL model available to children until they reach school age. So really everyone's situation is so different, and everyone's choices can be stigmatized. That's true. So I would say, unfortunately, yes, there is stigma, but it's very individual. It really depends on everyone's circumstance and preference and their identity and what culture they want to identify with, and so on.
Absolutely. And I think that one of the
question, sorry, it's
no
debate. It's not necessarily, but it's a very, very interesting question. Very good question.
I really appreciate you taking a moment to talk us through that, because just addressing the stigma is an important way for us as people who are interacting with non-speaking deaf people, just to make sure that we are taking these kinds of things into consideration when and we don't make assumptions that would get us into a place where anybody would feel uncomfortable. So that's super valuable. So thank you for speaking to that. We have another question from Nathan on YouTube, and he wants to know what actually got you into studying sign languages, because I don't think we addressed that at the beginning of the show.
Thank you for that question, Nathan. That's really interesting. I got into, I was interested in sign languages actually through my work. So in London, I used to work for the BBC, and I happened to work with many deaf colleagues, and I wanted to be able to communicate with them. And so I started learning British Sign Language, and I started and at the same time, I was completing my master's in linguistics, and it just seemed like an opportune moment to really delve deeper into sign languages and how, as someone who learned sign language later in life, how did that impact me? How did that even change my thinking? Did it do anything to my brain? Like learning languages is like learning a new skill, right? So your brain is so malleable. So I just became interested in how the brain deals with languages spoken and sign, or both at the same time, and how so that's how I got involved with sign language research, actually, through my workplace and also my master's thesis.
Fantastic. That's so awesome of you to integrate yourself in an environment to make everybody feel included and really have, I'm guessing, a whole new way of communicating just based on what we learned today, how different the languages are structured. I'm sure like the intentions and like tone of a conversation, so to speak, minus the actual auditory portion associated with that word, that like you get so much more rich information communicating in ASL with someone who's used to communicating in ASL than you would without learning that type of communication. It's phenomenal. All right, we've got time for 2 more questions, and then we're going to close it down for today. So our next question is, I've heard that there is slang or urban ASL that is continuously developed. How do you think, Zed, the LEX database will be able to incorporate these type of dynamic changes going forward?
Excellent. Oh my gosh, I wish we could, and I'm hoping that we could. So for ASL-LEX, it really it's a slightly different collection of signs. We do closely collaborate with other researchers and deaf-led teams. Namely, we collaborate closely with the ASL Sign Bank, led by Julie Hogesang, and it's in terms of collecting signs from across the diverse lexicon. So, for example, dialectal signs that only ever occur on the East Coast or in certain U.S. regions. ASL Sign Bank actually tries to intake or collect some of these sign variants and list them, and they do a wonderful job in continuously expanding the inventory of signs that hopefully at some point in future may be somewhat representative. Now, again, this is a very good point. Sign language is always evolving. So it always almost seems like our work will never be finished. But yes,
there's nothing wrong with that.
Definitely. I would recommend also checking out the ASL Sign Bank resource. It's also online. You can see a lot more sign examples, and they do actually have some regional variants that ASL-LEX doesn't currently include. But the 2 resources are actually compatible. So yeah, we work closely together. So yeah, there's some excellent regional signs there.
That's so cool. All right. So our last question for today is, for non-hearing impaired people who learn ASL early, for example, children of deaf parents. Does that have any impact on the way they learn other languages? And I'll extend this question to say like spoken languages or signed languages. Do you know anything about that?
That's a really great question. I think that generally knowing more than one language, knowing 2 or 3 languages is a really great thing for everyone. I think that with learning with having 2 languages, your brain has to learn how to manage the 2 languages. So for example, if you know English and French, and you're relatively fluent in both sign languages, in both spoken English and spoken French, sometimes you have to really carefully manage which language you're going to use, right? Because you can't speak 2 languages at the same time. But with one spoken language, say English and American Sign Language, like many hearing children of deaf parents would eventually have, that be somewhat fluent in both languages, then the brain doesn't, you would think it doesn't have to work as hard to control the 2 languages, because you can produce, or you could to some extent produce both languages at the same time. So there are different sort of control mechanisms, perhaps, and this is a theoretical question that many people are currently trying to understand, what the control mechanisms are for people who know 2 spoken languages, or people who know 1 spoken and 1 sign language, for example. And so to answer that question, I don't know if it makes it easier to learn another language if you have 1 spoken, 1 signed. I would just say, maybe.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah, I will say that I know in terms of spoken languages, if you learn them, this is related on a tangent. If you learn them both early, then they actually share cortex in the brain. So they're integrated into the point where like they're both like considered fluent languages, versus if you learn a secondary language early or later on, then they actually are physically separate in terms of like their location that controls them in the brain. And so bringing a physical component into it outside of the auditory component, I'm really curious, and I'm going to look into it after this show to determine, because ASL has a physical component, would it be in that same brain region, or would it share cortex with things that are more motor oriented, that are maybe nearby to cortex that controls language, but in a different way related physically. So that's super cool. Zed, I did have one more thing for you before we wrap up this presentation. I know that most scientists, including myself, tend to have some sort of story about paper publishing. Do you have any story that you could share with us about, like, silly or not? What has the publishing process looked like for you?
It's very long.
It's very long.
Sometimes painful. Involves a little wine.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I have stories about reviewer too.
We all do. Feel free. That would be perfect.
Reviewer 2.
Everybody hates reviewer 2. Oh.
Reviewer 2, just to those who don't necessarily know about the scientific publishing process, is the reviewer 2 is always the reviewer who gives you the most trouble.
The most trouble.
I don't have a specific story, no, but all I can say is whoever, particularly to younger students, grad students who are just getting into the scientific publishing and writing papers, I would say don't be discouraged. I think, a lot of the times reviewers are busy people, reviewers and editors are also very busy people. And sometimes they just want to most of them really want to help to make the paper a better paper. So I learned to look at it that way rather, some comments can be a bit snarky and not constructive. And I was like, where are you even going with this comment? Are you trying to write the paper for me?
Seriously.
So a lot of the times it's really kind of just bracing yourself and learning how to take all the criticism that you get, positive, negative, neutral, and just look at it as most people will want you to improve the manuscript. And, sometimes you just have to go and take your paper elsewhere. That's it, It's unfortunate. I do wish that the scientific review was a little bit more timely, just because science evolves so fast and so rapidly. So it would be great to get the papers out a little bit earlier. But yeah, that's all I can say.
Absolutely. I echo all of those sentiments. All of those sentiments. I will also piggyback on that and say, for all of those young scientists out there that get negative feedback, don't take it personally, because just because one person didn't like what you did doesn't mean that it's wrong or bad. And there's somebody out there that'll give you the feedback you need to bring it to the level that'll make it ready for publication. So that's that for tonight's program. I want to thank again Rachelle and Zed and Susan and David for joining us for today's episode of Peers in Pubs. And thank you, of course, to everyone at home as well. I also want to make sure that our audience is aware that you can keep up with Zed and Rachelle on their websites and Twitter and social media. We've been providing their handles in the chat throughout the course of the event, so feel free to reach out to them. And then I also want to remind you that we're on our social media channels and peersinpubs.org, so feel free to touch base with us at any time. And of course, we look forward to seeing all of you again. So thank you so much to everyone for helping out tonight. I really appreciate it. Lovely chatting with everyone.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you to the Interpreter for joining us today.
Of course.
And Rachelle, we'll celebrate later.
Yes, and Rachelle. All right, we've done it. Have a good night, everybody.